Each one of us has a grief experience that's unique, but we feel isolated when we feel like we're surrounded by people who are ignoring the fact that we're going through something hard, who aren't acknowledging that it looks really hard. We feel frustrated when people around us, including some of our best friends, get tongue-tied and they offer platitudes like they're in a better place or it takes a year or at least you had a nice relationship. The easiest thing to say is, I've been racking my brain. I wish I had the perfect thing to say, and I notice that I'm not reaching out to you because of it. But I care about you. I know you're going through something really, really hard, and I want you to be able to talk to me about it.
Hello, and welcome to Not Born Yesterday, a podcast dedicated to older adults and the challenges and joys of aging. I'm Miriam Goodman. Not Born Yesterday examines the problems and solutions of growing older today. We bring you the wisdom and voices of experts in the field of aging and offer tips on how to feel your best, use your lifetime skills and experience, and make the coming months and years as fulfilling as possible.
I'm Lynn Winter Gross. Not Born Yesterday is brought to you by Next Village SF, a local nonprofit providing older adults with support to help age in place.
Today on Not Born Yesterday, we're talking about loss and grief. These are not easy conversations for either the person grieving or those close to them. We feel awkward and confused. What should we say? Are those with a loss allowed to grieve openly, or do we have to act like we're not sad? How can we comfort our friend or family member? Too often, people avoid the grieving person or offer platitudes that make both the person saying them and the one suffering the loss feel less than supported. As we grow older, we have more and more losses in our lives, but loss happens to people of every age. Our guest today, Rebecca Soffer, lost her parents when she was barely out of her 20s. With another woman who lost her parents as a young adult, she created a website called Modern Loss.
Rebecca is the co-author of a book, Modern Loss, Candid Conversations About Grief, Beginner's Welcome, and also author of The Modern Loss Handbook. She's a writer and a former producer for The Colbert Report. Rebecca, welcome to Not Born Yesterday.
Thank you so much. It's such a delight to be here with the both of you.
You had a lot of loss at a young age. Can you tell us how you made that journey from grief to community?
I think that the reason that I had to make the journey from grief to community is because I feel that there is no other way to move through grief if not with community. And while I wasn't in a position where I could kind of cognitively put words to that realization, my entire body was feeling it, was feeling like, as you mentioned, my mother died. I was barely out of my 20s. I had just turned 30 and she was killed in a car accident. And my father died 3 years after that. And in those early days after my mom died, I was still in the extreme minority of people I knew who didn't have a living mother or, you know, it was still a rarity. And I felt like I had to kind of make my way through this whole living with loss thing on my own because that's the way it was suggested that I had to do it. No one else really suggested that grief is better carried and examined and dealt with and moved through when you feel like you're doing it in a way that isn't isolated. And it really only happened several months, even a couple of years down the line when I had burned out so beautifully from trying to manage all of this on my own that I realized like I can't do this on my own. Like I have to let it all hang out somehow. I need to find my people, not just the people who can connect with me about their own losses too and kind of help me along the way with their ideas and their commiserations and their bad jokes, their dark humor, but also just I need to find my people in the sense that the people who don't seem to be scared of talking to me about something that makes them uncomfortable. because they can't fix it for me or because they're scared that that thing might happen to them if they envision it too deeply. And so that's really how I made that journey, which was kind of it was a necessity for my own mental survival in loss, which I realized very quickly was going to be a forever thing.
You had a terrible loss, and somehow you've been able to share what you learned about yourself and how to live with that loss. Yet when others talk about loss and grief, each person might mean something different. What are some of the ways you see grief affecting other people?
I think that's an excellent question because I think that a lot of us hear the word grief and we think, well, someone died. Or we have this feeling that feels a lot like grief, but we tell ourselves that something's wrong with us for having a lot of trouble with an experience because no one died. So why am I having so much trouble? Right. And we do ourselves a disservice and we offer ourselves much less compassion than we should be offering ourselves and also others when they go through things that are absolutely grief, not maybe from death loss, but grief is an enormously wide-ranging experience. And at Modern Loss, I always say, if it feels like grief to you, it is. And that can be anything from infertility issues, divorce, estrangement, loss of identity. You know, so many of us have had our lives shifted around over the course of the pandemic. You know, we've moved homes, we've changed jobs, we've taken on additional roles in our lives. We're juggling. There's grief associated with being a caretaker, being a long-term caretaker, and the grief, you know, of having given up a part of your life that you might never come to realize, some dreams you might never see happen. So, you know, and of course, you know, grief over relationships that end, breakups, programs you don't get into. The list is kind of endless, and I think that we really need to do a better job of talking about that stuff out loud, because this is all grief. You know, it's not just, oh, someone didn't die, so why should I feel bad? I think that we'd be a lot kinder to ourselves if we kind of owned the fact that loss, we live dozens of losses every day. We just need to recognize them as such.
Many people who've lost a loved one need help, but they don't know how to ask for it. I remember reading about a woman who lost her best friend in a car accident and found herself grieving alone. She said, "We were supposed to be friends forever, sharing our challenges, but now she's gone and I can't share my grief with anyone." In your book, you wrote about a woman who lost her mother and said, "Everyone's comforting my dad because he lost his wife, but I lost my mother and I feel ignored." How can we as friends best support people with a loss?
Oh, I think that the most important thing, and this is where I could talk for a day about that, that response, but I think that the nut of it is the best way to support somebody else who is going through a loss is to make them feel acknowledged in their hard thing. We all want to be seen in the hard thing that we're experiencing. None of us wants to feel isolated in it. You know, no matter which way you slice it, grief and loss is an individual process. You know, even in the same family, you're not going to have two people who are grieving in the same exact way because everybody has a different relationship and memory and dynamics with someone who might have died. But there's a difference between feeling isolated and feeling like unique. So, yes, each one of us has a grief experience that's unique, but we feel isolated when we feel like we're surrounded by people who are ignoring the fact that we're going through something hard, who aren't acknowledging that it looks really hard. We feel frustrated when people around us, including some of our best friends, get tongue-tied and they offer platitudes like they're in a better place or it takes a year or at least you had a nice relationship. And yeah, that's all true. But what we really need from our friends is for the friends who really don't know what to say and then they shy away because of that. They're so scared they don't have the perfect thing. The easiest thing to say is, I wish, you know, I've been racking my brain. I wish I had the perfect thing to say. And I notice that I'm not reaching out to you because of it. But I care about you. I know you're going through something really, really hard, and I want you to be able to talk to me about it. I want to understand it. I promise you're not going to scare me away. There's nothing you could do that would scare me away. I'm here with you in this. People just need to feel like they have somebody who's willing to sit with them for at least just a bit of time and make them feel less alone in the hard thing, in the muck, in the uncertainty and the fear. And beyond that, practically and tactically, everybody has the capacity for empathy and for offering empathetic and helpful actions towards friends. Just think about what you're good at. Do you have a lot of time on your hands? Are you the anal person who likes organizing? Come over, offer if you can just like help them clean up. Do they have to go through someone's belongings? Are you good at that? Can you at least sit with them while they have to tackle a task that might be really, emotionally triggering so that they don't have to do it alone? Can you help them organize? Can you help them do paperwork? Or even just like take their kids. And when it comes to people who are older and trying to support each other, really, like a lot of times people just need company and they need to receive a message that there's no expectation for them to act or feel in any certain way when they're in that company. If they need to be quiet, that's okay. There's no expectation that they have to participate in conversation at a social outing. They just need to know that their presence is not only accepted, but wanted. Because a lot of us feel kind of like little grief pariahs when we're going through something hard. And we need to feel like our people in our lives are pulling us in, not kind of trying to push us out because they're uncomfortable.
So you talk about the different kinds of losses, for example, a miscarriage or a pet dying or something like that. Do you have any specific information for that? I know a friend of mine had a miscarriage, and the hospital called her on would have been her delivery date to see how she was doing. I haven't heard about any other medical facilities doing something like that, but that one was really important for her. So, do you think there's some specific things that relate to a miscarriage, to a job, to a move, to a relationship, to a pet that people should think about?
Yes, of course. I think that I mean that's a loaded answer. I think that, for example, your friend who had a miscarriage, the hospital following up with her, that's like, I would say that's more than 90% of the experience that I've heard that people have had with, medical centers. I think the medical community has a long way to go in terms of compassionate communication and follow-up support. And I think that the message here is clear, is that grief doesn't end with just sharing the bad news or the funeral or the memorial. It goes on forever. That's a date where somebody might be having extra trouble getting through their daily routine. They might be having trouble, going to work, being productive, and just having somebody who's bearing witness to the fact that they know that you've had a loss. They didn't forget that. And they're here to check in on you and see how you're doing in that given moment. That's gold to somebody who's grieving. That is absolute gold. You just have to stay present with somebody and know that grief is a marathon and absolutely not a sprint. Loss is a forever thing. So I love the idea of just like people kind of just folding it into their calendars. It really makes you an amazing support. And that you can do with anything, with a friend who's had a divorce, who had a terrible breakup, who lost a job. Just remember some important dates and reach out to them accordingly. It goes very far.
You had talked earlier about ways people can help. I just wonder if you could list some of the awful things that people say and things that we should never say. Like, even I understand how you
Sure.
feel. Yeah.
I think that one of the tenets of modern loss is that empathic community is best built when we share in ways that are raw and vulnerable and real with each other. And what I don't count as being raw and vulnerable and real are a whole suite of platitudes that we share with each other because it makes us feel more comfortable to share niceties such as, I know how you feel, or like I said earlier, at least you were close. They're in a better place. It takes a year, which it doesn't. Don't believe anyone who says that. Sometimes year two is even more painful than year one because it's when the permanence of things kind of settle in. And so people start feeling like they're going crazy if in fact it did not take a year for them. And then that helpful platitude you thought you were offering, that piece of advice, turns into something that really messes with their mind and their healing process. So, all of those things, like anything that starts with the sentence, the words at least, don't do that. Nothing that comes after at least is helpful to anybody because they know at least you were close. They know that they were close, or they know that they had lots of time or whatever, or they didn't suffer. That doesn't take away from the fact that they're grieving something or someone. Let them have that moment. Don't yank them out of their moment, because if they're not allowed to have their hard moments, then they're never going to move through them. And they're never going to really be able to build compassion and empathy for someone else who's having those moments. It's not fair to them. Things such as, like you mentioned, I know exactly how you feel. You do not. You do not know exactly how they feel. What you can do, and what is very helpful for people, is be willing to be someone who offers your own hard experiences, not as a one-upping way of doing things, but as you know, I know that your mom died, or I know your husband died. I've had a lot of loss. I've had my own loss, and I had my own really hard experiences. And if you ever want to talk about that, I'm really happy to share, because if there's anything that might be helpful for you from what I've been through, I'm happy to share with you, because it's really in how you couch it. Not I know exactly how you feel, because that sends the message that the person doesn't really have to share how they feel, because so it really shuts someone up. And then of course, in my opinion, the worst thing you can do is offer silence. To me, that's the worst possible thing. I would rather someone offer platitudes until the cows came home than go out of their way to pretend like somebody did not have something happen to them, because that's when you make someone feel really crazy and really invisible. Don't do that.
You've been involved in support groups. And why would somebody who's experienced a loss want to hear about somebody else's pain? I got my own pain. I don't really want to hear about yours right now. How is that helpful?
I think it's enormously helpful. And I think that support groups can exist in many forms. They don't have to be formal and guided by, a therapist or a practitioner. They can be very informal, such as the one you mentioned, which was my whole Women with Dead Parents crew. We were just a bunch of chicks with dead moms who got together and decided to start sharing about it. And the reason that it was helpful to us is because all we knew were our own experiences. And sometimes you really need to get out of your head and hear someone else's experiences as a way to feel connected, to feel less crazy. Like, you're not the only one going nuts with a certain, when you're approaching an anniversary, or the fact that your dad is dating someone new and they're awful and you're not ready. You need to feel like you're connecting with other people in that, because you shouldn't feel isolated. It's also an amazing way for you to kind of get coping mechanism ideas, to build connections with other people who are going through something hard, because when you build that connection, that's a real deep connection. That's like a preschool mom connection. You've been through the trenches together. Hopefully, that's a lifelong connection where you develop a shorthand where you can just cut through the crap with someone, because you both know that you're coming at a conversation against the backdrop of something really hard. And so I find that grief friendships are really built on a lot of empathy and like compassion and cutting each other a break, when someone snaps at you, you just assume maybe it's because they're having a really hard day because of something that happened. You don't assume it's because they're a jerk, you know? So support groups in any form, even online, even, virtual communities are amazing because they also expose you to other social mores and, societal and cultural practices and rites and rituals and creative ideas and art therapy and DIY ideas, ways for how to treat your body better and get better sleep and let it out. It's integral to our healing process and not just our survival process as people living with loss, but our thriving process. We can't do it on our own.
Different religions and cultures have ways of dealing with death. There are wakes and visitations and Shiva, for example. Do you find that these are helpful for those who are grieving?
Yes and no. I find that they're helpful if the griever finds it helpful. And they're not helpful if they don't. And that's not meant to be a cryptic answer. It's meant to say that, grief is such a highly personal experience. And I think that what surprises us the most, people who have multiple profound losses, is that we don't go through those losses, those grief experiences in the same way. I thought like, oh, my mom died. Okay, when my dad died, all right, I know how to do this. I'm not excited about it, but I know. But guess what? I didn't know because I had never had my dad die before. And also, on top of that, that meant that both my parents were dead. So I actually had an entirely different grief experience with my dad's death than my mom's death. My dad's death was much, much more existential for me. And so, whereas maybe the Shiva for my mom was very helpful. It was very comforting because I was surrounded by lots of people. And then say I'm Jewish, so the unveiling tradition, which typically happens a year after a death, where you literally like unveil a marker or a headstone at a cemetery if that person is buried. You know, that for me, everyone said that was supposed to be healing. That was supposed to be the year mark when things started getting lighter. And in fact, it was very hard for me. That was a very hard experience. And I was shocked that it was really that hard because the Shiva had been so comforting a year beforehand. And what made it hard was that I had this expectation that I was supposed to feel better after leaving that I was in year 2 now, and everyone had told me it takes a year and it'll get better. And it really ushered in a harder time for me. And so that's why I say yes and no, because you just never know. It's really important to meet people where they're at. If you're at a wake, you're at a memorial. Um, one of the rules of Shiva, which I'd only learned after my mom died, it's a brilliant guideline that I think every culture should absorb, which is you're not supposed to speak to the person who is grieving until they say something first. And that is incredible because I think the unspoken message is you got to see where they're at and then meet them there. And I think that that's how you approach any rite or ritual. You know, I say that because if anyone's listening to this and scratching their heads or raking themselves across the coals because, say, a memorial service was not what they thought it would be, or fulfilling, or felt like it had a sense of closure, which I don't think is an experience that actually exists in the world. That's normal. I think it's more normal than we lead it, we let on for it to be.
I was thinking of the Hispanic tradition, the Day of the Dead, La Dia de los Muertos. The whole family gets together and goes to the grave and brings the cigarettes that they liked and the food and all that. How does that ritual help?
I absolutely love Dia de Muertos, and I love it so much. I do it every year. I also lived in Latin America for many years, so I just really love. I think that it's such a beautiful tradition because, like you said, like you technically are supposed to go to a cemetery and just kind of have a party there. My parents, unfortunately, are buried in Philadelphia, and I don't live there, so I don't have that that option. But what I do is I create an ofrenda, which is an altar. And it's such an incredible prompt for me to remember my parents' lives as opposed to their absence and the way they died, which for many years really overtook me. That was my memory. I was grappling with how my mom died, which was violent and terrible. It was really hard for me to kind of embrace like her life and her joie de vivre and the little idiosyncrasies and the jokes and all these silly memories. It took years for me to be able to like start connecting with those. And so the Dia de Muertos is amazing because, you can create this ofrenda, this altar, and you can put pictures of the person and you can even put, something that my dad loved Goldenberg's peanut chews, which are really hard to find. So every year, that's my excuse to buy a big old bag and lay them on a table and, have some different, trinkets that remind me of them that they owned. And it really is, it's like literally bringing them to life in my own home. And it's an amazing intergenerational thing to do because my children will never meet my parents, ever. And they never got to have them as living grandparents. And when I do this with them, it's really a way for them to remember them with me and create those memories so that hopefully I can instill part of my parents' energies and ethos and silliness in my kids. It's a beautiful thing, and I highly encourage everyone to, I'm a cultural omnivore. So when you apply ritual to something, that's you're controlling it in a beautiful, beautiful way.
You created a course for medical students to make them more grief aware. What do you tell these students?
Yeah, actually, I built this course with the wonderful people at the Parmenter Foundation out of Massachusetts. They create wonderful, wonderful products and tools that fuel empathy and compassionate community in the world. And so we created this as part of their You Grieve series. And it's actually two different programs. One is an hour-long course for undergraduate students on how to build compassionate communities, how to become more grief aware, how to normalize the topic of grief. What does it look like? What does it feel like? How do you provide empathetic support to, say, roommates or classmates, colleagues going through it? And separately, as part of that program, we created an addendum course for medical students, veterinary students on how to become more grief aware, because as you mentioned earlier, Miriam, the hospital called your friend after she had a miscarriage 30 days down the line or on her due date to check in on her. That doesn't happen all the time, And I think that what we heard from the medical community is that there is a real lack of time dedicated to educating med students, not just on how to have compassionate conversations with patients and follow up on them, as opposed to just that conversation in the room where you're sharing hard news, but also how to recognize grief in yourself and honor it and care for yourself when you're going through something really hard as a medical student. As a med student, you're surrounded by loss. I mean, for God's sake, you're literally working on cadavers for part of your experience, and then you're going through rotations where you're seeing a lot of things. Veterinary students, I learned, they experience it's something like, I don't remember the multiplier, but it's like several times more death than the average human physician in an ER because they're dealing with animals who are hit by cars, who, they go downhill very fast. They are surrounded by death and loss and by their owners, their people who are grieving them. And so that's a lot to hold on top of the fact that these people are still people who have their own losses. And so we created a course that's really meant to encourage these students to really figure out ways to look out for themselves and for their peers when they're going through loss.
I'd like to get your feelings about how society has been mourning public figures. The first one that comes to mind is the outpouring of grief when Princess Diana died.
Mm-hmm.
People brought flowers and stuffed animals, and it seemed to go on and on and on. And I'm even thinking about the long lines of people who went to see the casket of President Carter when he died, or the Americans who are even mourning people who've lost things in the Los Angeles fires. These are public grieving examples that I just don't quite understand. I know it's not new. It goes back as far as President Lincoln, who went across the country, whose body went across the country, and people went down to the train stations and past the train tracks and wanted to give honor to a president they had never met. So I just wonder what your feelings are about this.
My opinion is that that's grief. That's collective grief, societal grief, and also individual grief. All of these public figure examples that you mentioned are, I was not alive when Lincoln was killed. Let's just clarify that. But neither were you. But with Princess Di, of course I remember when she was killed. And I think that so many people had this outpouring of grief because they saw themselves in her. They had a personal connection to her. There are so many different reasons that somebody would truly grieve the death of a public figure. She left two little kids behind. So you had people who were mourning someone, they were mothers themselves, and they were envisioning those children, or maybe what their kids might look like or go through if they were killed or died in such a way, or just died in general. You had people who had their memories, like maybe they went through a divorce and they saw Diana thrive and they really identified with that. And maybe she was a real source of inspiration for them. A lot of this real sense of grief is connected to somebody's own personal experiences.
Is there anything else that you want to tell people that we haven't hit upon about how to help a friend who is grieving?
Sure. I think that a really important way to help a friend is to, not in a forcible way or a way that feels really manufactured, but to naturally encourage them to seek out if they have the capacity to, and if not, to just really sit in and hold on tight to the moments of joy and lightness that come their way as they move through a loss. Because life is a mess, right? And the reason that comedy exists is because of the ridiculous aspects of life. And we have to laugh at them because sometimes they're just so painful and ludicrous that sometimes you have to laugh, right? And so to really encourage a friend who is going through something hard, that if they find themselves laughing, or if they go out and you're having a great time and they say, oh, God, I feel so guilty. I feel like, maybe I shouldn't feel happy. This person died or this awful thing happened, to really be the good force in their lives, saying, well, I promise you're going to feel bad again, right? Because you're grieving. So isn't this kind of nice that you found yourself laughing at something, or you found yourself enjoying this play, or we were being really silly, or you forgot just for a second? It doesn't mean that you didn't care. It doesn't mean that this doesn't mean something to you. It just means that you're a person, and you're a 365 person, and that person needs to let it out. And we all need a release valve. There is literally no connection between that and how much you cared about someone who died or whatever loss you had. And that is something that I wish that people would do a better job of supporting others on, as opposed to, say, talking behind their backs about, wow, she's dating so early. You're laughing because people do it. We are not nice to people. Everyone has the right to live in whichever way they need to, that allows them to connect with a meaningful life. And as long as they're not hurting themselves or anyone else, who cares?
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, Rebecca. Our guest is Rebecca Soffer, author and creator of Modern Loss.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a real pleasure.
Today on News You Can Use, we want to answer a frequently asked question. Why do women live longer than men? If you look around senior housing or a senior center or a village program or other adult classes, women do usually outnumber men. That's because in the United States, the average lifespan for women is about 5 years longer than men, and worldwide, it's 7 years longer. This holds true regardless of where one lives, how much money they make, and other factors.
Of course, we all know plenty of women who have predeceased their husbands or partners. but we're talking generalities here. So why do men seem to die earlier than women? First is heart disease. Men die of heart disease more often and at a younger age. In fact, men are 50% more likely than women to die of heart disease. That fact may be because men have lower estrogen levels than women. But medical risks such as untreated high blood pressure, unfavorable cholesterol levels may contribute as well.
Second, men often are less socially connected for reasons that aren't entirely clear. Research shows that people with fewer and weaker social connections, which tends to include men more often than women, tend to die sooner. Another risk factor is that many men avoid doctors and are more likely to skip routine health exams and less likely than women to have seen a doctor of any kind during the previous year.
Maybe it's an old myth, but men on average take bigger risks than women. They may drive faster, drink more, and engage in more dangerous physical activities. And finally, diet. Men on average pay less attention to what and how they eat. So what can be done to help men live longer? Since men tend to avoid medical care far more often than women, getting men to report physical and emotional symptoms, including depression, and urging them to go for regular follow-ups for chronic medical problems could help them live longer.
But things may be changing. Many doctors report that their younger male patients are taking care of their health and consulting their doctors regularly. The statistics won't change overnight, but at least this is good news. If you're a man or close to a man you care about, remind him that paying attention to medical needs, staying connected to others, and the usual exercise, eat right, and reduce stress reminders, that just might keep him around a little longer.
And that's our podcast for today. Our thanks go to our guest, Rebecca Sofer of Modern Loss. You can learn more about Next Village SF at their website, nextvillagesf.org. Our theme music is from Hook Sounds, and Jason Dahlstedt is our engineer. And we thank you for listening. We'd love to hear what you would like us to discover and discuss. Please contact us at notbornyesterdaypodcast.org. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. All of them are free, and they let us know our audience better. Be well, stay strong, and remember, you weren't born yesterday. I'm Lynn Winter Gross.
And I'm Miriam Goodman.